personal attention vid or something, you know, just some real generic comforting ASMR, because I feel like I haven't really done it for a little while, so that's what I want to do on that day. But anyway, this is true crime, and if you have been keeping up with my true crime videos thus far, then you will know that I am currently covering the top true crime case or the top killer of every decade, and this week we have the 80s, which was Richard Ramirez, A.K.A. the Night Stalker. Okay, that's probably what a lot of you guys will more commonly know this guy as. Also, just a side note, I don't know if the camera's picking up on it, but if you see any bizarre red blotchy marks on my face, I stupidly used one of those blackhead, is it like a vacuum? I think they're called like a blackhead vacuum this morning, and for some reason past me didn't put two and two together and think, oh no, this could make your skin look a little bit ropey for filming, and I think it has. And I love this camera, but my goodness, it does not miss anything, so I'm guessing that you guys can probably see that there's some weird pigmentation going on in my face. So if you have picked up on it and you're thinking, what is wrong with you today, then that's what that is. Anyway, like I said, we will be talking about Richard Ramirez, but before we get into the nitty gritty, I need to give you guys a disclaimer, as always. Okay, so this is going to be some very mature content. If you are like we'll start this again. This is going to be very mature content, okay? If you are below, say, the age of 14, 15, please click off this video, because I feel like you're going to be a little bit too young to hear some of the stuff that we will be discussing today. We are going to be talking about murder, abuse, sexual abuse, just a lot of horrible things. But the reason I make these videos is so that you guys can hear all of these interesting stories, because as much as they are gruesome and just horrendous, they are interesting at the end of the day, and I'm sure that's why you're here. A lot of us still do weirdly want to, all this sort of stuff does intrigue you as a human. You just are very, very curious, and so I like to make these videos for true crime fans in mind, so that you can hear this sort of stuff in a more comforting and relaxing environment, instead of, having to hear it through a really scary documentary with very scary music and awful acting. So if you guys, you like this sort of thing, then feel free to subscribe and be part of our growing community. I would love to have you here. And yeah, if this thing isn't for you, I do still post generic ASMR content, and I am only a baby channel, but we do already have quite a few generic uploads too. So if you guys would prefer to go and check those out instead, please feel free to click off this video and go and look through all of that sort of stuff on my channel instead. But anyway, without further ado, we will get into today's story. So as usual, I will give you guys some early life facts to sort of set the scene. So Richard Ramirez, who on earth was he? He was actually one of 5 children, and his father was a former police officer. He worked in Juarez, is it in Mexico? I'm guessing it's Juarez, I think. Correct me if I'm wrong. gash on his forehead, and then at 5 years old, he was hit again in the head by a swing, and this time he was knocked unconscious. From that point on, Richard was said to suffer from seizures. Now, just a interesting side note, if you've watched my previous true crime content, or you're a general fan of true crime, you've probably watched a lot of documentaries and whatnot out there, you can probably begin to draw some lines and notice a lot of similarities between the backstories of all of these different killers. Growing up in an abusive household often is one of these similarities, but there are also a number of killers that suffered from head injuries when growing up too. On my channel, we've covered the stories of Albert Fish and Ed Gein. Now, both of these suffered from some sort of head trauma, and Albert Fish, he was said to have fallen from a tree and hit his head, which caused him some brain damage. But of course, he was around in the 1920s, and medicine back then was nothing like it is now. And so the extent of this injury was never known. And with Ed Gein, it was his father that had caused his suffering. It's so horrible. He would hit him so hard that he would suffer from blackouts, and it's believed that it was this abuse that caused his lazy eye and speech impediment too. And I think we're always asking ourselves, why do these people kill? What happened to them to make them turn from a normal functioning human being to a killer? And so I think, this is another really interesting coincidence, and it makes you wonder if it really had such an impact on their psyche that it completely altered their mindset in some way, and then, they suddenly started displaying all of these weird behaviours and had all of these urges to kill. It really does make you wonder if that was one big factor that played into all of this. But anyway, back to Richard's story. Because his home life was so toxic, he would choose to spend a lot of his time at his cousin's house instead, who lived quite close to him. His cousin was called Miguel, and he was much older than Richard, and he had actually been an army combat veteran. He had served in the Vietnam War, and so this guy, he was very tough, but also just as equally messed up. Now Richard, he saw him, of course, as this older, cool cousin, and when he went to his house, Miguel, he would tell him all sorts of awful stories from his experiences of the war, and how he would participate in violent sexual abuse while stationed in Vietnam. He had a photo which showed him posed with the severed head of a woman. If any of this gets too much for you, again, please click off, okay? But he had a photo of him, he posed next to this head of a woman, and he himself had SA'd and then killed her. So clearly he is posting about all of this to Richard, and he thinks it's the coolest thing ever because, you need to bear in mind the fact that he was a child here. He was probably around 10, and so arguably he doesn't really know anything about abuse. Obviously he is being abused himself, but he doesn't know that it's right or wrong, and he doesn't really know anything about the world yet. He's just hearing all of these awful stories from his cousin and taking his word for it all. And yeah, so he's led to believe that all of this, excuse me, he's led to believe that all of this is just normal behavior. Miguel, he then Richard some of his skills that he had learned from being a veteran. These included how to kill and capture people, which is definitely a red flag, and it's definitely not something that you should be teaching a 10-year-old. Okay? And on the 4th of May 1973, Richard was over at Miguel's house when Miguel had got into a very heated argument with his wife. It had pushed Miguel over the edge, and he then ended up shooting his wife in the face. Richard, he oversees the shooting. He's not involved, he stays out of it, but yeah, he witnesses this shooting. And Miguel, he was then arrested and took to prison, but he was found not guilty by means of insanity, and he would then just spend the next 4 years in the state mental hospital, unfortunately. I think you could definitely say that this shooting must have impacted Richard in some sort of way. To see something so violent and to see somebody murdered in front of your own eyes at the age of 10, it's gonna do something to you. It's either going to really traumatize you for life, or it's going to influence you in a way that it really shouldn't for some reason, and it's going to, potentially turn you into a murderer also. So for a while after this shooting, Richard, he decided that he would prefer to just stay at his sister's house with her husband. Clearly, he just wanted to stay as much away as from home as was possible, and his abusive father, with it being such a harmful environment for both his mental and physical well-being. And his sister's husband, his name was Roberto. To put it frank, he was just an absolute creep. Like, there's nothing else that I can describe this man as. He was just such a perverted creep. He would take Richard with him on trips during the night and watch people through their windows. He would target attractive women and watch them undress and go about their evening activities. And yeah, he was just such a weirdo, and for Richard it seemed as though no matter what family member he was going to stay with, he was always going to be a part of a very toxic situation, and he probably had no perception on what a normal life or hobbies were for a child. He was just surrounded by all of these weird people in his weird family, and yeah, you do feel bad with all these murders. When they are children, you do feel for them because they weren't living the kind of life that a child should be. And when he became a teenager, Richard, this is where everything begins to go down south. He began to associate his sexual fantasies with violence. Yet another red flag. And while at school, he worked part-time at a Holiday Inn, which is one of those little hotels that you see like everywhere with I think they've got like a little green sign on them. Anyway, it's relevant. But he would use this job to his advantage, using his passkey to enter the hotel rooms and rob guests while they were gone. One night when he was working, he used his passkey and entered the hotel room of a couple. The husband had unfortunately left Richard did with his life between dropping out of school and the age of 22, it wasn't entirely clear. At the age of 22, though, Richard, he had decided that he was going to move from Texas to California permanently. When he moved to California, he first went to San Francisco, where he stayed in the Tenderloin district. On the 10th of April, 1984, he was staying at a hotel in San Francisco, and here he ended up murdering a 9-year-old girl. Just let that sink in the basement of this hotel. So this is where it gets really, really, really dark. I'm sorry, but his methods included essaying the girl and beating her, and then he finally stabbed her to death. This was said to be his very first known killing, but at first it wasn't actually connected to him at all, even after he was eventually arrested and convicted, which of course we will get into later on. This case, it was unsolved for many years, until 2009, when they were finally able to get a DNA match which linked to him. And so, yeah, it became very apparent that it was him who had committed this horrendous murder. He then ended up going down to Los Angeles, down south, and this is where he then committed further murders. And I'm going to give you a little bit of a timeline and details about some of these murders now, all of which were carried out in 1985. Okay, I'm telling you that just so I don't have to keep repeating 1985, 1985, 1985, because there's a lot of them. There were a few more murders that I'm going to not tell you about just because we would be here all day, because there were so many victims, and the murders I'm going to tell you about, I feel like they're the most, I guess, impactful on the community, and they are the most effed up. Not that any murder isn't effed up, please don't get me wrong, but I think it was these that really showed his true nature and just what a horrible, horrible man he was. And it was a lot of these murders did lead to his arrest because he had messed up in one way or another. But anyway, to begin with, on the 28th of June, a 79-year-old woman, her name was Jenny Vincow, was found brutally murdered in her apartment in Glassell Park. Now, it was said that she had been stabbed repeatedly while asleep in her bed, and that, I'm sorry, this isn't really gruesome detail, And the initial sequence, this emperor, he's singing this song, and he's like this really like self-centered, like he doesn't give a care about anyone else in the world, and he's doing this little dance, and then there's this poor little old man that gets in his way, and he starts shouting at this old man for throwing off his groove, and he gets him thrown out in like of his palace. That's how I feel right now with those fairy lights. They threw off my groove. It was going so well and so smoothly, and now I've just lost all composure. Brilliant. On the 17th of March 1985, Richard had attacked a 22-year-old woman. Her name was Maria Hernandez. She was pulling into her garage when Richard ambushed her. He ran up to her, pulled out a handgun, and then shot her in the face. Also, another side note, I'm sorry, I thought this was a little thought that I had. Obviously, when Richard witnessed that shooting in Miguel's house, Miguel had shot his wife in the face, and we'll go into all of these murders and you'll soon realise that one of his favourite methods of killing was to shoot people in the face. And I wondered, is that because of what he witnessed when he was younger? Is that what he uses as his prime example, dare we say, on how to kill a murder? Did seeing Miguel murder his wife impact him that much that he is now almost reliving it with his victims by shooting them in the face? It made me sort of wonder if that was the case. But anyway, this lady, she did end up surviving because luckily the bullet had ricocheted off the keys she was holding in her hands. So when she had gone to, lift her hands to her face to protect herself, the bullet really luckily, it had ricocheted off her keys. But Richard, Rich thought that she was dead. No. I swear to God. Richard thought that she was dead, but she wasn't. So he went inside of her home, where her roommate was unfortunately residing. She was a 34-year-old woman named Dale Yoshi Okazaki. I'm sorry if I completely just butchered that. But she had heard the gunshot from inside the house, so she hid behind a kitchen counter. She then raised her head above the counter to see what was going on, and unfortunately she did this just at the wrong moment, and Richard spotted her. his room, and next to Vincent was his 44-year-old wife, and her name was Maxine Levenia. There's so many names in this, wow. Levenia Zara. Again, I'm sorry. You know I'm going to butcher all of these pronunciations. It's not on purpose. I just have I don't know. I just have no idea how to pronounce words. Anyway, Richard, he shoots Vincent in the head, waking up his wife, who Richard then jumps on top of and he beats her. He then binds her hands and he demands that she tells him where all of the valuables are within the home. She tells him that there's some jewellery in their room and to take whatever he wanted, and he then leaves her on the bed while he ransacks the house. She actually managed to get her hands out of the bonds, and she knows that they kept a shotgun under the bed, so she sneaks out of the bed so that Richard can't hear her, and she manages to get a hold of this gun. And just as she does, Richard comes back into the room and she points this gun right at him. She pulls the trigger and nothing happens. It wasn't loaded. Of course, this then triggers Richard and it infuriates him even further, and he shoots her 3 times. And if that wasn't bad enough, he then gets a knife from their kitchen, gouges both of her eyes out of her face, and he puts them inside a jewellery box, which he then takes with him. I told you, this guy is just really sick. He is a complete and utter psycho. When Richard is leaving this crime scene, he actually leaves footprints in some flower beds outside the home from his trainers, or sneakers as Americans say. I think a lot of you guys that watch me are American, so yeah, if you're wondering what I mean by trainers, I mean sneakers. Anyway, police were able to make a cast from these footprints, and bullets had also been found from the crime scene, which were a match to those used in previous attacks. This was the moment where police realised there was indeed a serial killer out there tormenting Los Angeles. On the 14th of May, Richard goes down to Monterey Park and he enters the home of 66-year-old Bill, I think it's Doy, who lives with his 56-year-old disabled wife Lillian Doy. Now Bill was her main caretaker and he was in his room, and Richard, he entered this room and they have a confrontation. You know, the whole, what are you doing in my house? Who are you? Get out of my house. No, I'm about to murder you scenario. All that was, I'm guessing, played out. Bill, he then went to reach for his own handgun nearby, and as he does this, Richard, he just shoots him in the face. Again, Richard, he starts to roam the house, trying to find things to steal, and during his search, he finds himself in Lillian's room. Now he binds Lillian, essayed her, and then ransacked their home, and Bill, he sadly passed away after he was taken to hospital. Then on the 29th of May, Richard steals a Mercedes, a car, and he drives out to the home of 83-year-old Mabel Bell and her 81-year-old sister Florence Lang. Now Richard breaks into the home and he goes straight to the kitchen where he finds a hammer. Brilliant. He comes across Florence first, who he beat with this hammer first, house in Maple. He binds her wrists together, beats her, and then I don't know where he finds these, but he gets hold of some electrical cords somehow. Goodness knows how he manages to get hold of them, but he does. And unfortunately, he then uses these to shock both women. He then proceeded to S.A. Florence. He then grabbed a lipstick, which he used to draw a pentagram on Mabel's thigh, as well as on one of the walls in the bedroom, and the women, they weren't discovered until 2 days later. They were both still alive at the time and transferred to the hospital. On the 2nd of July, Richard stole a Toyota, and then he randomly selected the house of 75-year-old. Why did that sound a bit Texas? 75-year-old. I don't know what just came out of me. But he then randomly selected the house of 75-year-old Mary Louise Cannon. He quietly entered her home and found her asleep in her bedroom, and he beat her until she was unconscious with a lamp. He then tried to find any valuables in her home and left, and she was later discovered dead at the crime scene. On the 7th of July, Richard broke into the home of 61-year-old Joyce Lucille Nelson. She was asleep on her living room sofa. Richard beat her to death and kicked her in the head, which left another very clear shoe print on her face. Imagine, like, how hard are you kicking somebody to leave such a prominent mark on their face? After this attack, Richard decided that he needed a better tool and method to kill, and so he went and he decided to purchase a machete. Yeah, this story only gets worse and worse. So Richard, he continues his hobby of stealing cars, and after he finishes with them, he wipes them down and ditches them, and he finds a next one. He then drove out to the home of 66-year-old Lila Naiden, I think it is, who lived with her 68-year-old husband Max. He bursts into their room where they were both asleep, and he kills them both with this machete. After he was certain that they were dead, he then shot them in the head. That rhymed, sorry, that was really morbid, but also, yeah, it rhymed. And just as with all of these other victims, he robs the house, taking all of the valuables he could find. On that same night of the 20th of July, at 4 a.m, Richard breaks into another house belonging to another couple. A husband and wife were asleep in their bed, and Richard shot the husband, killing him instantly, and then bound and essayed the wife. This couple had an 8-year-old son. Yeah, it gets even worse. And unfortunately, he comes walking into the bedroom, hearing all of this noise and commotion, and Richard, he bounds this 8-year-old and drags him around the house, telling him to show him where all of the valuables are. And it was said that while he was dragging this poor boy around the house, he demanded him to swear to Satan that he wasn't hiding any of these valuables or money from him. He then left the child bound in the house, who was able to make his way out of these binds, luckily, and he ran to the nearest neighbour's home for help. On the 8th of August, Richard, of course, he steals yet another car, shock horror, and he chose the home of 27-year-old Sakina Abawath, I think, and her 31-year-old husband, Elias Abawath. Sometime after suppose they didn't really want to scare Richard Ramirez away, but you've got to prioritise keeping the public safe, like, as much as you are prioritising capturing this guy, surely. So you'd think that they would find some sort of way to alert the public, but they hadn't for a good while. But then finally a televised press conference had taken place, and it was during this conference that they referred to Richard Ramirez as the Night Stalker. Viewers were advised to lock their doors and windows as someone was randomly in the area breaking into all of these houses to commit murders, and they could really be targeting absolutely anybody. This press conference ended up actually annoying a lot of people, especially the LA detectives, as they knew Richard would be tuning into this conference too, and they knew that he would now try to make a run for it or destroy any sort of evidence in his possession that they could use against him. So all of these detectives were just peeved that the media had made this sort of public announcement, and they were right. Richard, he was watching, and he now knew that they were onto him. Investigators had realised at this point, using the footprints he'd left in the flower beds, the type of trainers Richard Ramirez would wear. These trainers were mentioned in the conference, and so Richard, he had gotten rid of them by driving to the Golden Gate Bridge, which is of course in San Francisco, and he drops these trainers into the water. He then decided to remain in the San Francisco area for a few more days, and then afterwards, for reasons unknown, he decided to head back to the Los Angeles area. On the 24th of August, Richard, he has the urge to break into another house again. So he drives a little outside the Los Angeles area, and he is lurking outside of someone's home. Inside of this home was a 13-year-old boy named James. He was wide awake, and he heard the footsteps of somebody outside of the window. At this point, everybody was aware of the Night Stalker, and they were of course all living in fear. So when this little boy hears these footsteps, he just presumes it's the Night Stalker, and so he runs to wake up his parents, and they start talking, really loudly, making sure that they make enough noise to ensure that whoever is outside knows that they are all aware of their presence. This actually spooks Richard, and he gets into a stolen car that he had picked out for the night. Meanwhile, the little boy James, I don't really know if he had snuck out and done this against his parents' will. I'm assuming so, because why on earth you would let your child leave your house when you know there's a potential murderer outside is beyond me. But brave little James, he managed to get out of his house somehow, and he brought a notepad with him to note down the colour, make and model of this stolen car that Richard was in. He was also able to make out a few of the numbers and letters from the license plate. James then contacted the police with his family, and they handed over this information and told them anything else that they could from the incident. The stolen vehicle that Richard was driving at the time was found on the 20th of August. Police were able to obtain a fingerprint from the rear view mirror, even though Richard was usually quite thorough with cleaning these cars and not leaving a trace. He had clearly missed a spot at this time. Now the police, of course, they are very excited about this, and they go straight back to the station to try and get a positive match. And when it does come back, they finally have a name Arizona. I don't know what Arizona is. Wow. Where his brother was living at the time, and his brother, for some reason, he was completely unaware of what was going on at the time, and he didn't know that Richard was now a identified serial killer. Every newspaper and TV program in California was reporting on this story, it was everywhere. So it clearly must not have either reached Tucson, or perhaps his brother just wasn't really much of a TV reader. A TV reader, wow. A TV reader or a newspaper watcher. You know what I mean. In the end though, Richard, he didn't meet his brother, and he changed his mind, and so he hopped straight back on a bus from Tucson straight back to Los Angeles. Now, it's unclear as to why he did this. Maybe he was worried about his brother and he didn't want him to be seen as like an accomplice to him, or maybe he was worried that his brother did know that he was a serial killer, maybe he was keeping it from him because he was going to turn him in, or who knows, we don't know, but for whatever reason, he went straight back to LA. So on the 31st of August, Richard gets off this bus, and when he's walking down the street, he spots a newspaper rack, and on every single one of these newspapers on this rack, his face is just plastered right across the front page of them all. Obviously, this causes him to panic because he could now be easily recognized by everybody, and he realizes that it's not safe for him to just be strolling down the street. He begins to run, and he tries to cross a motorway. He then stops a woman in her car and tries to take it off her. Other people nearby, they slow down and they see clearly what is going on, and they stop him from trying to steal this car and torment this poor woman. He then escapes, and he hops over several fences, attempting another 2 car thefts, and these thefts were also unsuccessful, and he finds himself in East Los Angeles, which is quite rough, apparently, and he's in a very scary neighborhood. He stupidly attempts yet another car theft, but this time he is then attacked by a group of men who are just, hanging around the area. They're standing on a street corner, minding their business, doing their own thing, but they see him trying to steal this car, and so they begin to attack Richard, and one of them strikes him over the head with a metal bar, which prevents him from getting away as it knocks him out. The group, they then take it in turn to beat him, and they held him down until the police eventually showed up. Karma, I guess. And Richard, of course, he is then arrested and he is put into prison while waiting for his court hearing date. At his first court appearance, of course, the media, they were all there to report on it, and Richard, he had, wow. In the previous stories we've covered on my channel, someone's always doing something weird for the media, and this case is no different. Richard, he had decided to carve a pentagram on his hand, and so he's showing the media and the cameras this pentagram, and then randomly he just shouts, "Hail Satan." Wonderful. On the 3rd of August 1988, the Los Angeles Times reported that jail employees had overheard Richard Ramirez planning to shoot the prosecutor with a gun. Okay, he was bragging about how he was going to sneak this gun into the courtroom, and about exactly how execute his plan. I think that's maybe the first part of this plan that he did wrong. You know, if you're planning to do something as elaborate and as ballsy as this, maybe don't tell everybody what you're about to do. You know, that would be a good start. And so, after overhearing all this, a metal detector was therefore installed outside of the courtroom, and then on the 14th of August, the trial was interrupted because one of the jurors didn't arrive, and later that same day, she was found shot to death in her apartment. So of course, the whole jury, they are terrified, and they're all thinking now that somehow Richard had done this or directed this. And later on, it was then determined that Richard was not actually responsible for this woman's death, and it was actually her own boyfriend that had shot and killed her instead. But isn't that such a strange coincidence? Of course, it still left the jury just scared for their lives because it was such a bizarre coincidence. But yeah, it's like spooky. It's a little bit uneasy. I don't know. But now this is where this story gets even worse. Even worse, guys. Believe it or not, as I mentioned, the media, they're covering this story. And Richard's photo, it's being shown to everybody, everywhere. And a lot of people thought that Richard Ramirez was a good-looking man. They thought, you know, he was really attractive, and so he had attracted a fan base. Yeah, he was receiving hundreds of letters which disclosed just how much people were in love with him and how they were fans of his work. How are you glorifying somebody's murders in this way and calling them their life's work? People just really are so insane. But people they'd even come to visit him while he was in prison, and one of these fans was a woman called Doreen, and she was one of his biggest fans. In total, she had written him 75 letters, and they were, quote, in love. During this trial, women, they were crowding the courtroom just trying to get a look at Richard Ramirez, and many of these fans were just so infatuated by him that they had become seriously delusional, and they genuinely thought that this man, this murderer, was innocent. You know, everything points to him. Oh, but he's so good looking. Like, how could it be? How was it him? He can't be a murderer. Yada yada yada. These people, I would argue that they were just as insane as Richard. I don't know where you stand on this, but that's my personal opinion. So that juror, the one that was sadly shot by her boyfriend and that had died, she was then replaced by another woman in the jury. Her name was Cindy, and she was in love with Richard too. She was obsessed with this man. She would go as far as to write him little love notes during court and letters in prison too. First of all, how on earth did she even just like giving each other these lovey-dovey eyes throughout the whole thing. Like it's disgusting. But yeah, but ultimately on the 30th of September 1989, Richard Ramirez was convicted of all charges: 13 counts of murder, 5 attempted murders, 11 SAs, and 14 thefts. Now, this next part really confused me, because during the penalty phase of the trial, on the 7th of November, Richard Ramirez was also sentenced to die in California's gas chamber, but this never went ahead. And I was confused by this because this death sentence was also given to him in 1989 while he was being convicted of everything else. And the last use of California's gas chamber wasn't until 1999. It had been deemed as far too much of a extreme punishment, and so yeah, in 1999, California's gas chamber, it was no longer in use. So between this death sentence being given and the gas chamber being ruled out as a punishment, 10 whole years went by, and yet Richard Ramirez's death sentence was still not carried out. And not to mention, even after the gas chamber was ruled out, the lethal injection was still then authorized in California, and I think to this day, I think it still is like legal, but for some reason, like they haven't really used it since 2006. So for whatever reason, this death sentence against Richard Ramirez, it was just never carried out, and he didn't actually die until the 7th of June 2013, when he was 53, and he died from blood cancer in the end. But going back to delusional Cindy the juror, just some extra contextual information if you were curious. Richard ended up being actually very upset with her because in the end she didn't take his side for whatever reason, and she was still disappointed though that he had been given this death sentence, and she went on to do quite a few TV appearances actually, insisting how she felt that he had been poorly represented and that in her opinion he didn't deserve the death sentence. And in 1988, Doreen, the other very delulu woman that was in love with Richard, remember her? She had been proposed to by Richard, and they were married on the 3rd of October 1996. They were married in the California San Quentin State Prison. true crime.